Hello and welcome to All the Games You Like Are Bad. I'm your curmudgeonly basement dweller Mark Bigney, and today we're going to be talking about Cry Havoc. Cry Havoc was designed by Grant Rodiek, and I sincerely apologize for these pronunciations I'm about to inflict on you, Michał Oracz and Michał Walczak. It's an asymmetrical, sci-fi, multiplayer war game. I say war game with some hesitation because I'm very sympathetic to the brand of pedantry that distinguishes war game from any game with war. But we'll set all that aside and call this a war game for the purposes of simplicity. I really wanted to like Cry Havoc, but it is with great disappointment that I say that I really don't. I do, however, see the audience to which it could appeal, and hopefully I'll be able to do enough of a good job to explain why this is a game you might like or might not like, case depending. First off, I would like to utter a very mild and petty series of component gripes. One of the things that initially attracted me to Cry Havoc is the rather awesome cover art. It's got a great sort of sci-fi power armor badassery to it. It's crisp and neat, and it is not replicated anywhere in either style or substance anywhere else in the game's components. The card art is all different. You don't see this power armor person except maybe in the sculpts of the minis, but the sculpts of the minis are all kind of blurry and muddy, and I don't like the poses either. They're kind of reminiscent of Games Workshop about 30 years ago. It's also the case that the card art shows a lot of stuff that never happens in the game, like big space fleets and undersea stuff and all kinds of other things. So there's kind of a disconnect between a lot of the cool things about the components and what actually transpires in the game. Cry Havoc is an area control war game in which you score points almost exclusively by holding territory. It's about scrabbling for dirt and holding that dirt, and that's how you're going to get your points. And ultimately what I find so disappointing about Cry Havoc is that it strangles you. Most of your time in Cry Havoc is about wrestling with the game's limitations, about the incredible roadblocks that it throws in your path to doing even basic tasks. And to do well, in large part, is to overcome those limitations. Now, don't get me wrong. Every game, to a certain extent, is defined by its restrictions, by the things that it lets you do, and perhaps almost as importantly, what it doesn't let you do. If a game had no restrictions whatsoever, at worst that would result in our just being 7-year-olds running around the playground again, arguing which princess is prettier, or who hit who first, or whose magical invincible shield is more invincible than someone else's invincible shield. But I think that Cry Havoc goes too far in the direction of restriction. Let me give you a tangible example of how Cry Havoc strangles you in terms of what might happen in the very early turns of the game. Every round in Cry Havoc gives you 3 actions, and there are only going to be, on average, about 4 rounds in a game. That's been my experience. So that's 12 actions. But even being generous, let's assume that the game goes the distance and lasts the full 5 rounds. That's only 15 actions over the course of the entire game. One of them might be, at the very beginning part of the game, to move out and, I don't know, conquer territory, because that's how the game, that's what the game is about and how you win the game. You start off with 4 dudes in your headquarters, and you might say, alright, let's go to adjacent territories and take them over. Not so fast. To do a move action, you need to discard cards that generate movement points. And if you want to move your 4 guys out, you're going to have to generate 4 movement points. Your starting hand is 4 cards. If you're lucky, then you can generate 4 movement with 2 of those cards. So you spend one of your actions, namely a third of the round and a 15th of the entire game, and maybe as much as half your hand or more if you're not lucky, just in your first deployment outside your home territory. What makes this worse is that if you want to actually reliably be able to grab that territory and keep it, just a single territory mind, you're probably going to have to move out all your forces to do so, because there's a good chance that if you move into one of the contested valuable territories, and the uncontested ones are pretty crappy, but in order to get anything good, you might have to move out all your guys in order to make sure that you have to keep it. And then, in order to get more guys out, you have to spend another action and maybe the rest of your hand just to get people out into your headquarters. There you go, that's round 1. Parenthetically, that battle that you might have started by moving out in the first round, that's only going to be executed at the very end of the round. Battles don't happen when they start. And in point of fact, if you move out in action 1 of a round to go claim a territory, that territory is on complete lockdown until the end of the round. Nothing goes in, nothing goes out, with very, very rare and occasionally confusing exceptions. So you can't move through it, you can't reinforce it, you can't retreat from it, you can't even really move around it. So anytime you start a fight, you're locked in there. As a result, over the course of a game of Cry Havoc, when you make expansion, it's very slow, very gradual, and it's despite the fact that you're wrestling with incredible limitations on actions and cards that drive those actions. You don't end up doing much, and what little you do comes at a high cost. I don't find that very enjoyable, personally. I find that when I'm wrestling more with the game systems than I am with my opponents, I don't find that makes it as engaging an experience in terms of game design or in terms of strategic choices. Now, sometimes when you're playing a co-op game, obviously all you're doing is struggling against the game itself. But when it's a multiplayer competitive game, I don't want the system to get in my way sometimes as much or more than the other players. Part of that's personal preference, so take that for what it's worth. Let me analogize this crudely to some other games. Think of any game you like where you have a certain restriction on what you're able to do during the course of a given turn. The example I'll start with is Tigris and Euphrates, which is my favorite game design. On your turn, in Tigris and Euphrates, you get to do 2 actions. Now, this is enough to get something done, but not necessarily everything you'd want to get done. Could the game be balanced if you only had 1 action on your turn? Well, theoretically yes, but why would you want to? With 2 actions, you're able to get some stuff done, but not everything. With 1 action, you'd be able to accomplish far less. Sure, the turns would be quicker, but you wouldn't really get to do anything, and on your turn, most of the time, you'd just be thinking about how you can't get anything done. That's not enjoyable for me, and I think that a good game gives you just enough on your turn so that you're able to get things done and have a sense of accomplishment without just being able to run the table or run around doing whatever you want. And this isn't unique to Euro games, don't get me wrong. The same can be said of Eldritch Horror. In Eldritch Horror, you have 2 actions, and you get to do some of the things you want to do, but not all of the things. Could you have rebalanced Eldritch Horror so that you do 1 action on your turn? Possibly, but why would you want to? Similarly, you could probably rebalance Eldritch Horror so that you do 20 actions on your turn, but that wouldn't necessarily be a good idea either. There's some balance about being able to do too much and being able to do too little. And Cry Havoc, for me, is an incredibly frustrating experience. Calling back to that example of just how to project force into adjacent areas, it gets even worse later on in the game when you try to project force into non-adjacent areas. The only place you can recruit to is your headquarters, and recruiting more guys costs precious cards, of which you only get 4 a round, and precious actions, of which you only get 3 a round. Remember, only 5 rounds in this game. If you want to try to attack or reinforce an area that's 2 spaces away, every guy you bring there is going to cost 2 points of movement. And not every card generates a whole lot of movement for you. You might have to waste your entire hand and one of your actions just to defend what you already had. And these are the kind of trade-offs that you often have to make in a game of Cry Havoc. Perhaps balanced, perhaps strategic, but not enjoyable for my tastes. There are some other actions in Cry Havoc that really drive home this notion of feeling like you're being strangled. One of the actions you can do is just to draw a card. That's an entirety of your action. And given the parsimony of actions in this game, it really feels like a wasted turn. Sometimes it's the good play. It's the smart move. But it really doesn't feel satisfying. And so even when you're making progress, it's scant progress, and it's not satisfying. At least not to me. Let me contrast this with other recent war games of past memory. One that I'll start with is Kemet. I've talked about Kemet before. Kemet is indicative of some of the new design philosophies for multiplayer conflict games that seek to avoid a lot of the problems inherent in, say, a base game of Risk. In Risk, you're encouraged to turtle, there's lots of king-making possibilities, and fighting is often a bad idea because if 2 players fight, then often it's in the interest of the 3rd player just to stand back and then pounce on the survivors. To a certain extent, some of these problems show up in Cry Havoc. The way that games like Kemet avoid them is by introducing 2 salient qualities that I've now discovered are characteristic of all of the sort of multiplayer conflict games that I enjoy. One of them is that the map is a little bit open. You have movement options past just moving into an adjacent space. They don't have to be cheap, they don't have to be easy. Sometimes they can be risky, but still, it gives you options. So you're never really hemmed in. In Cry Havoc, you're hemmed in all the time. As I say, battle regions get locked down, and that seriously constrains your movement options, and you have this very slow sort of metastasis of territories you control over the course of the game. In Kemet, you have things that you can reach easily, and you can have things that you can reach slightly more difficultly, and then things that will take a lot more effort to get to. And over the course of the game, you can decide to go after these different kinds of targets. You might be able to go all the way across the map if you're willing to pay for it, and that gives you flexibility, a tactical and strategic flexibility about where you want to go. It also means that you're in a position to engage with all the other players. You're not hemmed into your corner of the map such that you're only interacting with a subset of the other players. That's really a virtue. Another thing that Kemet and other games like it do is they have multiple victory conditions. Fighting is, of course, very, very prominent in a game of Kemet, don't get me wrong. But there are two elaborations. Number one, there are other ways to get points. You can build up your infrastructure, you can build your economy, you can just buy points outright, it's expensive, and it's something to do while you're trying to rebuild your military force if that's the case. Or if you don't have any valid military targets in that turn. In Cry Havoc, if you don't have any valid military targets that turn, and that happens all the time, congratulations, you're going to be spinning your wheels for a substantial portion of your all too few actions. Also in Kemet, we don't have this problem of Pyrrhic victories. If you walk in and you win a fight, but then you're seriously weakened in the process, first of all, you've already accomplished part of your goal. Winning the fight was the goal, not necessarily holding on to the dirt. You can choose to hold on to dirt in Kemet, but that's not the only game in town. You can just have taken the points that you get from winning the fight in the first place. Cry Havoc tries to do this kind of thing. You do get some points transactionally from winning a fight, but honestly, they're a drop in the bucket compared to the amount of points you get from holding on to territory. So if you walk in and you win the fight, but you're bloodied in the process, someone can snatch it from you very easily, and suddenly all that effort that you went to, all those precious cards, all those precious units, all those precious actions went to waste. And again, sometimes it's worth it, sometimes it's balanced, sometimes that's the right strategic choice. Not enjoyable for me, incredibly frustrating. It makes me feel like any progress I make is largely illusory, and it comes comes despite the fact that the game is trying to stop me, as opposed to my opponents trying to stop me, which is a perfectly legitimate strategic engagement with other human beings, which is kind of sort of why we're playing games in the first place, but call me crazy. It's also the case that Cry Havoc has this somewhat novel mechanism of the battle board, and a lot of ink has been spilled on this digitally. When you move into a fight, you can send your troops to different priorities. And when I read about this, it sounded awesome. In practice, though, it's less than awesome. You see the same sort of standard deployments time after time after time. The overwhelming majority of the time, all the options are largely illusory, and you see the same stock deployment repeated. The only times when battles are genuinely interesting are when, number one, both sides are relatively numerically even, number two, both sides are not incredibly tiny, and number three, both sides have battle cards that they can bring to bear in the context of the game. Given what I've already said about the scarcity of resources, you can imagine how frequently this happens. When that happens, these battles are interesting. They're fun to do, and they're fun to watch, even as a bystander, but generally speaking, you're going to see this only a couple times over the course of the game, if that. That's been my experience anyway. And so I really don't think that this mechanism, which sounds really cool, has a chance to shine given the other things that are going on in the game. So that's a bit of a disappointment as well. So ultimately, for my money, when I'm going to play a multiplayer conflict game, I really want it to have a flexibility of map and multiple victory conditions. I've already talked about how Kemet does this. Another game that I think does this very well is Senji. You can use naval movement, which is risky and potentially expensive, but it can get you all the way across the map if that's really where you need to strike. There are lots of different ways to score points in Senji, as well as winning fights, in addition to winning fights, rather. Senji has a lot of detractors, and in fact I've had some difficulty introducing it to people, but I really like it, and I know a lot of other people that do. And it really shows, at the very least, whether you like Senji or hate it, it shows what you can do in terms of opening up a standard dudes on a map design, so as to make it more flexible, give you more strategic opportunities, even without the addition of a lot of extra rules grit. This isn't necessarily about simplicity, this is just about openness of design and not strangling your players and confronting them with too many obstacles to actually playing the game. So let me talk a bit about what Cry Havoc does well, because it does do some things rather well. For one thing, it has multi-use cards. Any given card can be used for a multiplicity of different things: movement, recruitment, building, and action. You have to pick one of those, and looking at your hand of cards and determining how to best use them is indeed mildly interesting. The problem is it's married to a game design where you can't really get anything done. But the way that the cards themselves are designed is kind of cool. And multi-use cards is a design innovation that's largely been stolen wholesale from wargame designs of the card-driven variety, and I think this should be done all the time. Multi-use cards are great. It's a wonderful design innovation and should be done all the time. Another thing that Cry Havoc does kind of well is the fact that all the forces are asymmetric. There are 4 different factions in the game, and they all play differently. Now, personally, The difference manifests itself to me as feeling like I'm being strangled in slightly different ways every time I'm playing the game. When I play the red faction, I feel the movement restrictions are really killing me. When I play the green faction, I feel like my recruitment restrictions are really killing me, and so on and so forth. So it doesn't really help allay my base concerns with the game, but if these concerns aren't a problem for you, then the asymmetry is probably going to be very pleasing to you. There are some lingering concerns about balance. I haven't really been in a position, I can't really comment definitively on whether or not the factions are balanced, largely because my experience at the end of the game is not, oh well, I got trashed because yellow is so much stronger than the other factions. More like, I've really been frustrated by the fact that I couldn't do anything over the course of the game. But I will point out that it's somewhat worrying that so soon after release, the game has an official fact released, and it's not just a fact, it's also some errata. They're doing some post-publication rebalancing of some of the faction abilities, precisely because some of them were deemed to be too strong. And this is a couple weeks after Gen Con, so I'm a bit concerned by that. I'm also concerned by the fact that the lead designer, Grant Rodiek, or at least the guy whose name is mentioned first in the largest font, hasn't played the final version. He basically, it's been out of his hands for quite some time. So there have been a couple of embarrassing exchanges where he very nicely tried to answer rules questions, but he did so giving wrong answers because the game had changed since he'd last seen it. This has contributed to the general sense of rules confusion. Also contributing is the fact that the rulebook is pretty bad. Also, the individual who wrote the rulebook hasn't played the final game. When you read the rulebook, it's one of those rulebooks where you think, oh, this is straightforward, I understand everything, and everything makes sense, and then you sit down to play it, and suddenly you realize that there are fundamental ambiguities in rules questions, and you don't know how to proceed. I've read lots and lots of rulebooks. I'm the primary game explainer for the game group where I've played. And I had some serious troubles getting to grips with the core mechanics of the game in lots of instances, partially because the rulebook's problematic, and also because I think maybe the design itself got a little overbaked, too many cooks in the kitchen maybe. I'm not sure. I don't want to speculate more than I already have. But suffice to say that it's not as clean as it should be, and there are some lingering rules problems. So, to summarize, I wish I could have liked Cry Havoc. It's got some cool stuff going for it. I do like the way it deals with cards, and I do like the way it deals with faction asymmetry. But every advance and innovation that it's done is hampered by the fact that you just can't get much done in the game, and the game throttles you and strangles you. And the faction asymmetry is somewhat undercut by the fact that there's still a lot of lingering unclarity about how a lot of special abilities work. And guess what? By the time you actually get to play the game, they might have changed from when I recorded this video. Who knows? But if you're the kind of gamer that has played games with extremely limited actions available to you that really, really throttle your progress, and you figure, this is great, this is what I want, a sort of, and I say this without judgment, a sort of sadomasochism with respect to game design, then I say give Cry Havoc a try, it may be for you. But if you're like me, and you really value conflict games that are slightly more open, give you the option to target many different people instead of just gradually plunking along in adjacent territories, I think that you're going to find Cry Havoc as frustrating as I have. You don't have enough cards, you don't have enough actions, you don't have enough time, you don't have enough options to move, and that's not really enjoyable for me. So I can't recommend Cry Havoc if you've got that set of priorities. I hope I've done a reasonably good job of laying out why you might like it, though, because there is stuff to like. And if you do like it, if you do enjoy being strangled by these designs, you obviously have different tastes than I do. In which case, I think it's wrong, but I forgive you. Thanks very much, and take care.